This happened during winter break when I was in college. My best friend and I decided to rent a remote cabin in the Colorado mountains. We wanted a quiet place to relax, away from the noise of the city. The cabin was tucked deep in the woods, with no neighbors for miles. The only way in was a narrow, snow-covered road, and by the time we arrived, the snowstorm was already picking up. The first night was peaceful at first. We lit the fireplace, cooked a simple dinner, and spent hours talking. But just as we were getting ready to head to bed, I heard a faint crunching sound outside. At first, I thought it was snow falling off the roof, but the sound grew louder. It was unmistakably footsteps, slow and deliberate, moving closer to the cabin. I peeked out through the frosty window, but I couldn't see anything, just the dark silhouette of the trees. My friend tried to convince me it was probably an animal, so we ignored it and went to bed. Around 2 a.m., I woke up to the sound again. Only this time, it was right outside the bedroom window. My heart started racing. I stayed completely still, trying to convince myself I was imagining it. But then came the knock. Slow, steady knocks at the front door. I froze in place, barely able to breathe. My friend whispered, "Did you hear that?" And I nodded. Neither of us dared move. The knocking continued for what felt like an eternity before stopping abruptly. We didn't sleep the rest of the night. When dawn finally came, we cautiously opened the door. That's when we saw them. Footprints in the fresh snow circling the cabin. They stopped at every window, including the bedroom. The tracks led back into the woods, but they disappeared after a few yards. We packed up and left immediately. To this day, I don't know who or what was outside that night. But I know one thing. Whoever it was, they were watching us. A few years ago, I spent the winter holidays with my grandparents in a remote Finnish village. Their house was surrounded by endless forest, and the nearest neighbor was miles away. It was the kind of place where nights were so quiet, you could hear the snow falling. One evening, as my grandfather and I were shoveling snow from the driveway, we noticed something strange. At the edge of the forest, there was a snowman. It wasn't there earlier, and no kids lived in the area. The snowman was tall, with stick arms and 2 rocks for eyes. We laughed it off, thinking maybe someone from the village had passed by and made it. But the next morning, the snowman was closer. It now stood just a few feet from the driveway, perfectly intact. My grandfather joked that maybe it was the wind that moved it, but I couldn't shake the uneasy feeling growing in my chest. That night, I couldn't sleep. Around midnight, I heard a faint scraping sound against my window. My stomach dropped. I forced myself to look, and my heart nearly stopped. The snowman was now in the yard, directly facing my window. I woke my grandfather, who grabbed his rifle and went outside to check. When he came back, he looked pale. "There's nothing there," he said, but his voice shook. I peeked outside again, and the snowman was gone, just faint tracks leading back into the forest. The next morning, we found pieces of the snowman scattered across the yard, like it had been torn apart. My grandfather refused to talk about it, but he made sure to lock every door and window after that. I still wonder who or what made it, and why it was moving. In December 2015, I decided to go on a solo hike in the Swiss Alps. I'd been hiking for years and felt confident in my skills. The weather was supposed to be clear, so I packed light and set off early in the morning. The first few hours were perfect. Fresh snow, crisp air, and stunning views of the mountains. But around noon, the weather changed suddenly. Snow started falling heavily, and the wind picked up. Within minutes, visibility dropped to almost nothing. I tried to backtrack, but the snow was coming down so fast, it covered my tracks. That's when I saw him, a figure in the distance, wearing an old-fashioned coat and a wide-brimmed hat. I called out, and he turned to look at me. He didn't say anything, but waved for me to follow. Desperate and disoriented, I followed him. He stayed just far enough ahead that I couldn't get a clear look at his face. Every time I thought I was catching up, he'd turn a corner or disappear into the snow, only to reappear a moment later. After what felt like hours, he stopped and pointed ahead. I saw a small hut, barely visible through the storm. Relieved, I ran toward it, shouting my thanks, but when I turned back, he was gone. Inside the hut, it was freezing and abandoned. There were old supplies scattered around, and a newspaper on the floor dated 1936. That's when I noticed something even stranger. The walls were covered in carvings, all of them the same phrase in German, "Follow the guide." Later, when I told locals about my experience, their faces grew serious. They told me about a guide who had died in a storm decades ago while trying to save a lost hiker. Many people claim to have seen him over the years, always leading them to safety. I'm grateful to him, but I'll never forget how unsettling it felt to follow someone who wasn't really there.